here because I am not a political theorist, nor am I a political scientist. I am a interloper historian, and so I need a few notes because I don't usually talk this talk. And I am aware that my status here is something of a dilettante, but here we go, okay? So, what I understand we're doing and talking about today is the state of the parties. And I don't think, and as Matthew mentioned, there's no mistaking that the state of the parties is the cause of lots and lots of consternation. All you got to do is a Google search. All you got to do is look at any set of publications. You can look at things like The Economist or The New Yorker. I'm telling you what I read. Hey, but there's a lot of talk about the state of the parties. So this is a really kind of big issue. And I think most immediately the catalysts for this consternation are the catalysts that Matthew mentioned. In 2016, the Republicans had 16 candidates competing in their primaries, and they nominated Donald Trump. In 2020, the Democrats had 25 candidates competing in their primaries, and I agree with Matthew in his assessment. I believe they will nominate Elizabeth Warren. So that's a fairly interesting set of circumstances, as we've already been introduced to. My comments today on the state of the parties have three elements, three things I want to address. I want to begin first with some reflections on how I, not a political theorist or a political scientist, understand the function of the parties in modern political regimes. I want to turn next to how I understand the contemporary dynamic in American politics and American parties. And I want to conclude with some considerations of proposals for possible reforms. So that's what I want to do. By far, the largest part of what I have to say is the second part about the contemporary dynamic. So first of all, some reflections on the party concept. In some ways, a party idea, an idea of party, especially if you combine it with the idea of faction, has a long history that just in terms of what I'm teaching this semester, just the courses I have this semester, I can detect a lot of different places. So for example, in one course, I'm teaching a lot about Thucydides right now, and it's certainly visible in Thucydides. I'm going to soon in that same course be teaching Machiavelli's The Prince, and I think it could be seen to be evident there. I just recently in my Western Civ class talked about Hume's Of the Original Contract, an essay I think is just an exercise in genius because I am, after all, a Humean. And we encountered Whigs and Tories there. And of course, in other courses, there are various groupings in the English Revolution or in the French Revolution that I have occasion to mention. So there is a way in which the idea of party has been around in some form or fashion. But in other ways, party is a very modern idea. And it's an idea that I associate in my training with the rise of a mass electorate that developed in the 19th century. Political parties were an assembling power. They organized the new electorates that came with a new mass society. And they did so in two ways. Ways that, at least in my view, roughly correspond to a Marxian on the one hand and a Weberian sociology of the party on the other hand. So what are these two ways? The first way, way one, or the first way, is to imagine the function of parties as the representation or representing developments within civil society. And in this way, you can imagine parties as agents of class advance, as sites of theory elucidation, as catalyst of change, maybe even catalyst of revolution. Another way is to imagine parties and the function of parties as a question of the exercise or the acquisition and exercise of power. And that acquisition could be either through bureaucracy or charisma, but the acquisition and exercise of power. And here, parties could be imagined as countervailing authorities. They could be imagined as sites of rationalization. They could be imagined as carriers of experience. So the party idea has these two sides. One side, representation of civil society. The other side, the acquisition and exercise of power. In both cases, political parties also function as intermediaries. When I turn to the contemporary dynamics in US political parties, I think what we see is a contemporary process of, it's a mouthful, of disintermediation. Something about the intermediary role of parties is breaking down. So disintermediation. I think this process of disintermediation dates to the years 1968 to 1972. So it's something I think that's relatively new. And I think it dates to the McGovern-Fraser Commission. McGovern, you should probably associate McGovern with the Democratic Party. So it happened within the Democratic Party first. And what the Commission on Party Structure and Delegate Selection more or less decided to do, and there are a number of things I'm just going to mention too, I associate it with creating the modern primary system. It's not like primaries existed only after this point. They had existed before, but not so generally as they do now. And it also, I associate it with various rules to reflect the constituencies that make up the party. And in the first case, we have the Democrats, but it quickly extended to the Republican Party. This is a fundamentally democratizing move. And I think, Matthew, you mentioned that. We're in a world in which American parties are more fundamentally democratized than parties in much of the rest of the liberal, democratic, and industrial world. So what we're doing here, in effect, is taking those two functions of the party, and the modern primary system doesn't abolish the acquisition and exercise of power, but it does radically shift the emphasis in parties, as I understand it, to something that is more in the world of representing civil society as a way to acquire and exercise power. So we have a shift, a relatively dramatic shift from the power exercise function of parties to the social representation function of parties. It seems to me that at some level, this is a perhaps necessary antidote to the professionalization of politics and a self-perpetuating political caste. You don't necessarily want politics always to be about the same folks who look the same, talk the same, and in effect make politics moribund. So in some ways, it's good to open up some fresh air, an aggiornamento to the parties. That's not, I'm sorry.
No, I love it. I love it.
So, yeah, maybe that's a setup for you. To the parties. Maybe that's not a bad thing. But at another level, it is, I believe, an act of suicide. Parties gradually lose intelligible boundaries, and they gradually lose enforceable norms. And I think it's reasonable to see, and this is not a partisan comment, it is reasonable to see Trump among the Republicans, or Marianne Williamson, or Tom Steyer, or Andrew Yang among the Democrats as symptoms of a political anomie. So, to elaborate, there seems to have been several consequences of the contemporary primary system as it was established in the years after 1968 to 1972. And I'd like to identify what I think are 5 of these. And again, I'm not a systematic political theorist. These are the 5 that essentially kind of occurred to me as I imagined what I'd be talking about today. First of all, I think the contemporary primary system places a premium on short-termism over a cohesive and coherent vision for the long term. In some ways, there's an elective affinity between what's happened in our politics and in some ways what happened at virtually the same time in our economics as we moved from a stakeholder economy to a shareholder economy. An emphasis on the short term and a de-emphasis, not an exclusion, but a de-emphasis of the long term. And none of these contrasts I'm going to be giving you are exclusive. They are relative contrast. So it places a premium on short-termism. Second, I think it advantages individual candidates over party leaders. And the word I would probably wish to emphasize in that is the word individual. What we might be looking at here is we have, and to talk about 2 aspects of this, is that we now have the emphasis going from experts with government experience, experienced politicians. Marianne Williamson doesn't strike me as an experienced figure in government, okay? Just saying, maybe I'm missing something. But, anyway, and fortunately, she's not in the debates anymore, at least fortunately from my point of view. But
Most unfortunate. She provided tremendous value.
yes. If you were to watch for 3 hours, you needed some breaks. Okay. And she provided those for sure. Now it's up to Andrew Yang. Okay. But now you have experts at electoral politics, and I think that's an important change from people with government experience to people who are good at electoral politics. It's not that somebody who's good at electoral politics can't also have government experience, but the shift in what you're specializing in is, I think, important to recognize. In Burkean terms, I think this means that there's less accountability to the public and more accounting of self-interest. And that's a difference that Burke emphasizes in his reflections about constitutions that accentuate accountability and those that accentuate accounting. Thirdly, this change that occurred in the years after 1968 to 1972 had a third effect. Given what I understand to be the intensification of I can never say this word, gerrymandering, okay? It just doesn't come out of my mouth right. And the proliferation of safe districts, two developments, by the way, that institutionally seem to me connected to what we're talking about with the fate of the parties. I think there's been a tendency to magnify extremes. We have more and more a politics of conviction taking precedence over a politics of responsibility. So 3 developments there. These developments, in my opinion, appear to be magnified by other developments. The fourth thing I would want to point out, it seems to me that the rapid rise, or the rise of and rapid expansion of social media is something we have to take into account. This kind of magnifies the 3 things I just mentioned, and I think it also tells us that we are seeing the erosion of another intermediary power, that of the press or that of the Fourth Estate. And finally, the second magnifying development, in my opinion, is reforms to campaign financing, which leads me to what I think is the second major event that contributes to that mouthful, disintermediation. I had to practice, to get it right, so it didn't come out in a jumble. Disintermediation, okay? And that second development came in 2002, and it is the McCain-Feingold reform, the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act of 2002, which limited soft money contributions to parties. This development, as I understand it, disabled the capacity of party leaders to enforce norms through the power of the purse, and it enabled the capacity of more anonymous special interests to challenge norms through the power of the purse. I do like parallel structure, in case you haven't noticed. Okay. So that's what I think is the contemporary dynamic. And I think that means we have ended up with an electoral process populated by a proliferation of political adventurers. I also like alliteration. So we have a political process populated by a proliferation of political adventurers who relate the party more by the threat of exit than by the promise of loyalty. We've also ended up with an electoral process that, again, in my opinion, offered the prospect of being more representative, but has actually turned out, again, in my estimation, to be, if anything, less representative. We have, in fact, a pretty fundamental paradox at work in our contemporary politics, in my view. A process that is, in some sense, more responsive to groups in civil society ends up being less representative, while a less responsive process seems to have been more representative of the country as a whole. That's my assessment of the contemporary dynamic. I have a little bit more time, right? Yeah, okay, just a couple of things. On the possibilities of reform. Okay. Many of the changes that I've talked about, I don't think are going to go away. I don't imagine everybody's going to stop looking at their phone. Look, all 3 of us have our phones out, okay? I don't think that's going to happen. So when I think about possibilities of reform, I think about Federalist 10. I think about controlling effects, because we're not going to get away from the kinds of developments that have, I think, put us in this place. And I think we want parties that are open to civil society. We want new ideas. Maybe occasionally we want some fresh faces. But with a Burke or a Tocqueville or a Weber, people I'm happy to take my stand with, I think we should also value institutions and political class. These things, I think, are important, and we're missing the importance of these things. Now, I am neither a political philosopher or a political scientist, and I can't tell you when I'm sitting up here between Gladden and Matthew, I'm feeling a little bit like I shouldn't be here, okay? So I know that, okay? But there are a couple of things that do occur to me in terms of reforms that would be thinkable. Reforms in terms of controlling effects, not transforming society. For example, since I especially have a kind of background in European history, I think maybe too much of France. I'll leave it there and put a period there, and then I'll continue. I think too much of France, and I think maybe a specified campaign period. Maybe that would have some value. I think, too, of less gerrymandering, more coherent districts. I think of closed party lists of candidates. I think of reforming campaign finance reform to direct more money to parties. Let me be honest. I see little or no possibility for any of these institutional reforms or others, and I can think of quite a few others, in the present political climate, in the present constitutional climate. There's a fifth thing we might think about doing, and in some ways this is what I think is probably most needful. And that is, we have, I believe, a fundamental problem in citizen education. In education in classrooms, or preferably education in participation, we might find some avenue to learn some of what I think are the quintessentially political virtues. The virtues of compromise, an ethic of responsibility, maybe a tiny bit of prudence, maybe a tiny bit of humility, and maybe even some humanity. To learn, in short, one of my favorite passages in all of philosophy, that politics is the strong and slow boring of hard boards. It comes from Max Weber, Politics as a Vocation. For me, that's the touchstone. Here again, I am rather doubtful, and that's a euphemism, okay? The state of the parties rests on the state of the union. And when we can't even agree on basic facts, and we have become so totally inured to moral turpitude, it is really hard for me to imagine any real prospect for civic education. Maybe I'm unduly pessimistic about the state of the parties and also the state of the union, but sometimes I'm inclined to think I see in the contemporary United States a kind of distant version of Thucydides' Corcyra.